Okay, so what I want to present about, as Alison has alluded to quite a few times, thank you, Alison, is addressing the seed sourcing issue, and especially how provenance trials can inform us about best practice seed sourcing for best outcomes for restoration, and especially in a climate change context. And decisions made about the geographic location of seed for restoration can have significant consequences for restoration success, and probably as a consequence of this, over the last 10 or 15 years or so, numerous seed sourcing strategies have been proposed with the objective of maximising restoration success. This illustration here diagrammatically represents some of the key elements of the various seed sourcing strategies proposed. So here, within some landscape context, the Swan Coastal Plain, for example, the star here represents the restoration site, Kings Park, for example, and the green circle then represents the relative location of seed source sites, and the circle size represents the relative proportion of seed sourced from that site. So at the top here we have what is generally recognised at the moment as best practice, that is that local is best, and this is largely based on our understanding of the importance of local adaptation in driving spatial genetic structure within species, so that the use of non-local seed is relatively maladapted compared to local seeds, and there are relatively negative outcomes for restoration success. Recent challenges to this local is best assumption include composite provenancing and admixture provenancing. And these are really underpinned by notions of increasing evolutionary potential. By increasing the amount of genetic diversity in our seed mix, then you're increasing the resilience of those restored populations to deal with the environmental challenges that they're faced with. And these strategies have also been proposed as a mechanism, as a way of addressing potentially negative issues associated with small fragmented populations. If our local populations are small and fragmented, potentially they may produce relatively inbred seed, and there are negative consequences from that. More recently, there's been much more focus on addressing climate change, and so predictive provenancing here suggests that what we should be doing is sourcing seed from sites that are currently experiencing the climatic conditions predicted for the restoration site at some point in the future. An adjustment of that, and sort of tapping into the composite provenancing idea, but adding a directionality to that, is this notion of climate-adjusted provenancing, whereby you're increasing the local genetic diversity with non-local diversity that is along some climate gradient, for example, increasing aridity. So in the example of the Swan Coastal Plain, Kings Park, for example, simplistically, thinking you're sourcing from source populations to the north. Ultimately though, although there's a lot spoken and written about the various strategies that we should be implementing, there are very few studies still that have assessed these various strategies, and especially in a ecological restoration context, and especially in a local ecological restoration context. And here provenance trials provide a powerful test to assess these strategies. And so over the last 10 or so years, I've been involved in a number of provenance trials conducted in a restoration context. Some of these studies have been published, others haven't yet, but will be. And over a range of species, including important tree species, jarrah, marri, tuart, she oak, some understory species in Gomphylobium and Stylidium, and then of most relevant here, and what I want to focus on in this presentation, is Banksia menziesii and the studies we've conducted in Banksia menziesii. Species, of course, well known and well loved in this audience, so I don't need to go into too much detail to describe it. Most important point, though, is that its distribution is about a 400 kilometre north-south distribution along a very strong climatic gradient. So the rainfall at the northern limits of the distribution is about half of that of the southern limits. And obviously seeds are limited in supply and expensive, and so it's important that we use these seeds as efficiently and effectively as possible. So the objectives of this study I want to share with you were to conduct a large-scale provenance trial in an active restoration context, so we're using post-sand mining sites that Alison alluded to, the Hansen sites and Iluka site at Eneabba, to ask, firstly, is there a provenance effect? Does success vary depending on the source of seed? Is that success associated with climate distance? That is, as you go further from the local source site, is there a decline in the performance of non-local material? Is there a home site advantage? And the third question is there evidence for this predictive climate-adjusted provenancing strategy? Are seed from hotter, dry sites more successful or perform better than those from the local and or cooler, wetter sites? So to address these questions, we conducted very large-scale provenance trials with Banksia menziesii in 2013 and 2015. This slide basically just runs through how we went about setting up these trials. So just very quickly, 20 seed from each of 10 plants from each of 24 source populations. These source populations from across the distribution of Banksia menziesii, including the northern extremes of Kalbarri and Eneabba, and then easterly extremes on sandlands populations at Lakes and Beverley. 24 source populations in all, and these were planted into each of two sites in May 2013, 9,600 seeds in total, and each of three sites in May 2015. With 14,400 seeds used in this trial. The trial sites were Eneabba, Gingin and Nangara. Gingin and Nangara in 2013, and all three sites in 2015. And then within each of these sites we had suitable replication and the way that we planted material out, 10 seeds from each of one maternal from each of 24 source populations, and these seeds were planted out at 1 metre intervals like this. So planting them out at 1 metre interval and a little bit of competitive seed planting was a good way to achieve the objectives. And well done, Ryan. You did a fantastic job there. Thanks, mate. Alison, you could have done better. What we also did then was assess climate at each of these seed source sites, because we determined that climate distance was the best predictor of performance, ultimately, of these provenance seed. And so we measured a number of climate variables at each of these source sites in the way explained here, and then assessed the climatic distance between each of these sites, and particularly the trial sites and the source sites. And over here just showing the range in rainfall, and I alluded to that doubling of rainfall between the north and south populations. So, on to results. And so this shows then the germination and early survival as a function of climate distance of seed source from the Nangara trial site in 2013. So on the y-axis is the proportion of early survival, germination and early survival. On the x-axis is the climate distance from the Gnangara trial site. So the Gnangara trial site is shown here in yellow. Sites to the left are the source sites that were hotter or drier, essentially to the north of Gnangara. Sites to the right are those that are cooler and wetter, essentially south of the Gnangara site. Overall average of germination and early survival was 75% effectively, and that's indicated here by the dotted line. What's of interest here is that I think you can see that there's an association between climate distance and the performance of the different seed sources, so that the worst performing provenances were those from the hottest, driest sites, and that the seed from the cooler, wetter sites were better performing. And another way to think about this is where those sites fall in the context of that overall average. And so those seeds from those hotter, dry sites, 70% of those sources performed worse than the overall average, whereas 77% of the seeds from the cooler, wetter sites performed better than the overall average. These are the results from Gingin in 2013, and essentially we see the same sorts of results, the same sorts of trends. So here, 83% of the sources, the hotter, drier sources, performed less well than the overall average, and 82% of the seeds from the cooler, wetter sites performed better than the overall average. These are the results for 2015. It was a particularly dry year, so overall germination and survival to 6 months was average 4.8%. Despite that, we still see these same trends. So, the seeds from the hotter, drier sites, 80% of those sources fell below the overall average, compared to 70% above that overall average from the cooler, wetter sites. And again, the same in Gingin. Even though there was only 1.1% survival to that 6 months, we still see those same sorts of trends. And then this plot then summarises those statistics for seeds sourced from hotter, dry sites compared to seeds sourced from cooler, wetter sites for our 2 provenance trial sites for both of those years. And you can see a consistent trend here across the bottom where in each case the seeds from the hotter, drier sites perform less well than those from the cooler, wetter sites. So for example, in Gingin in 2015, that success was half that of for the seeds from the hotter, drier sites than those from the cooler, wetter sites overall on average. So clearly no real support there for benefits from sourcing to address climate change issues. This plot shows the rainfall for each month for the Gnangara site, the overall average in the solid bar there, then the rainfall for the 2013 year. Here it's here showing that winter was particularly wet, and that accounts for that high 75% overall average for germination and survival. But then basically when we got to October, from then on, essentially rainfall for the 6 months through summer was 10%, that long-term average. A consequence of that in that particular year was that all of the seedlings died. That was disappointing, but there was an opportunity there that we seized, and that was that we could go into these sites and dig up these seedlings and measure biomass, so we could dig deeper to measure survival, measure success by way of measuring biomass. And we did this for almost 3,500 seedlings. So we dug the seedlings up and measured above ground biomass and below ground biomass and the number of seedlings. And then all of these measures were combined into a composite measure of seedling vigour, and that measure then is represented in this plot by the y-axis. So this is this composite measure of success based on seedling biomass and survival as a function of that climate distance from Gnangara. And again, what we're seeing here, so here's our Gnangara local source material, and what this is showing is a decline in the biomass, the seedling biomass, as we move away from that local Gnangara source site. And that's interesting then contrast to what we saw for a simple count of what was surviving at 6 months, where we had this higher success. So what this is telling us is that although there were more seedlings there, that in terms of biomass, they were smaller than the local seedlings. So finally then, in conclusion, we did see this highly significant provenance effect on germination and seedling survival that was associated with climate distance from that home site. Most critically, we found no benefit for increased survival associated with sourcing material to address climate change. And this was despite a harsh summer at these trial sites, where you might have predicted that material from those hotter, dry sites might have performed better because it was a particularly hotter, drier summer at that source site. Not only no evidence in support of that, but in fact that they performed significantly worse. Ultimately, from the seedling biomass data, we end up concluding that we have strong support for local is best. We have some hypotheses to explain this home site advantage that we're digging deeper into, trying to explain. And we can ask the question whether climate change is already impacting on seed quality at these hotter, dry sites, and whether that's an issue. And ultimately what we need is more long-term provenance trials like this. This is data just on one species. There's a lot of other species we need to do similar work on to build up that picture of understanding. Thank you. And thank you to all those people. Go ahead.